Hello and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. I'm Stephanie Valdez, co-owner of the bookstore. Tonight, Daniel Barban Levin joins us to present his new memoir, Slonim Woods 9, in conversation with Rebecca Sachs. Community Bookstore will be celebrating 50 years in business this fall, and we credit the support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you so much for spending an evening with us. Now for some housekeeping. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. If you'd like an audio transcription, you can turn that on at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We'll ask some of those at the end of the program. There's also a chat button at the bottom through which I'll be posting a link to purchase tonight's book if you haven't already. And finally, we've scheduled a whole host of follow-up programming. For instance, this Thursday, Sigrid Nunez joins us for the paperback release of her newest novel, What Are You Going Through? And she will be in conversation with Andrew Martin. Now I'll tell you a bit about tonight's guests and we'll get started. Daniel Barban Levin holds an MFA in poetry from the University of California, Irvine, where he taught creative writing and rhetoric, and a bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College. He is the winner of the Stanley and Evelyn Lipkin Prize for Poetry, the Lynn Garnier Memorial Award, and is the recipient of fellowships from the Frost Place, Tent, the Sarah Lawrence Summer Seminar for Writers, and the Community of Writers at Squaw Valley. His writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Provincetown Arts, Bat City Review, the Sarah Lawrence Review, the Westchester Review, the Offbeat, the Fourth River, and the Bennington Review. He lives in Los Angeles. Rebecca Sachs is a graduate of the programs in writing at the University of California, Irvine. She has been awarded grants, prizes, and fellowships from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Elizabeth George Foundation, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and the Mellon Sawyer Documenting War Seminar Series. A graduate of Dartmouth College, they worked for several years at Vanity Fair before moving to Tel Aviv to pursue an MA in Jewish Studies. City of a Thousand Gates from HarperCollins is her first novel. They live in Los Angeles. Now I'll turn things over to you, Daniel and Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So Daniel is going to start with what we said, like a five minute or so reading.
Yeah,
So,
sounds about
awesome.
right.
Take it away. I'll turn off my camera while you're reading.
Great. Okay. Hi. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book. All right. When sophomore year began, I stood on the second floor landing of Slonim Woods 9, looked down on our living room, and thought, this is perfect. The floor was a strange gray-beige tile, broken in places. The walls were all exposed brick. Next year, my junior year, I would study abroad. By some fluke, I had gotten into a school out in the English countryside, a concept so inconceivable to me that I wouldn't think about it until it happened. But for now, I had everything I could possibly want. Our windows looked out on a cliff and trees, the curated nature of Sarah Lawrence. I still didn't know Talia and Isabella all that well, but I was living with my friends, people I loved, people who were full of energy, people who were complicated but kind, people who liked to do the same things I like to do, like play Super Smash Brothers on my GameCube and throw parties and dance on the coffee table. We did all of these things as the year began. Then Talia gathered us in the living room to tell us that her dad was getting out of jail. By coincidence, Talia and I had attended the same high school back in New Jersey. She was a few years older than me, so we'd never crossed paths. What I didn't know, but would learn later on, was that she hadn't finished high school. When her parents divorced, Talia's mom, who according to Talia was evil and abusive, had stolen Talia's younger sister, Ava, and devoted all of her energy to destroying Talia's dad, Larry. Still in high school, Talia had rejected her mom's custody and emancipated herself in a show of loyalty to her dad. Minutes from the mall in Bridgewater, New Jersey, where I'd been seeing Sacha Baron Cohen movies, eating orange chicken in the food court, and trying out iPods in the Apple store, Talia had been living in a homeless shelter. She told me and everyone else all of this again and again. If you sat with her in the living room, if you tried to grab a plate from the kitchen cabinet while she was cooking, if she cornered you in the hallway outside the bathroom, whenever we might interact with her, it was like a lecture series on Larry and Talia's misfortune you hadn't signed up for. I blamed myself for my own discomfort around her. If I was a better, less selfish person like Isabella and Santos, I would have sat down to listen more often. But it was undeniable. Talia was a hero. Larry was a hero. And now he was getting out. Talia's dad arrived in the morning, and he wasn't alone. The front door of Slonim Woods 9 opened to a landing, then up a few steps, and you were in the wide-open living room. We knew he was coming. It was Talia's big day, years of waiting building to this, the return of her father. As usual, most of us were strewn around the living room, while some were at class or seeing friends. I happened to be coming down from upstairs when the door opened. He looked small at first. Maybe it was because he was still standing in the entryway. Maybe it was the backpack strapped to his back, which in some ways made him look like a school kid. He was round, I noticed, his head gleaming like a tan cue ball. As he stamped up the steps, with friends filing in behind him, his daughter rushed across the room and jumped into him, pressing herself into his chest. One of the men stepped forward and introduced himself as Lee Chen. Lee had a long black ponytail reaching down the back of his dark suit. Behind him was an older man who seemed gruff, but whose eyes watered as he introduced himself as a detective and an old friend of Larry's. Bringing up the rear was a Bon, in his 20s, tan and sharp-edged, who Larry referred to as a fellow Marine. These men made a point of shaking each of our hands in a sort of procession, as Talia disappeared further into her father's thick arms, almost invisible in his embrace. He turned to us, moving Talia to his side. She looked like an extension of him, something growing out of his hip. Thank you to all of you for looking out for my daughter this past year. Everyone was silent, unprepared for this moment. Most of us had barely paid attention to Talia, beyond knowing that this reunion was all she'd been talking about for over a year. How were you supposed to react to something like this? A family separated unjustly and now reunited after years? We had all chosen willingly to leave our parents, to come to this imaginary world, to study subjects we had never heard of, and to live, for the first time, exclusively with people our age. We couldn't imagine being separated from our families against our wills. We couldn't understand how such a thing was even possible. Larry had an arm around Talia and Isabella now. They were standing barely inside the room, bordered by the men who had delivered him to our door. Now, let me make you all some real food, he said, grinning.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I love hearing your work. And, well, I wanted to start our discussion by talking about curiosity, actually. We learned so much about you as a writer, but also the young person that you were in terms of like what's observed all around you. Even in that section, you read, our windows looked out on a cliff and trees, the curated nature of Sarah Lawrence. So it's like I'm learning like so much about the eye that sees. And I just wondered in general if you could talk a little bit about the role you feel kind of curiosity plays in your writing.
I mean, it immediately you had said something to me a long time ago that really helped make it possible for me to write prose at all, which was just that the most effective way to characterize someone is by depicting what they see, right? So I just did that with myself. And I think that, you know, I started writing when I was young because I felt this seemingly unbridgeable gap between how I felt inside and what was going on internally and then the external world. And I didn't really understand how to be seen or heard, and so writing was an attempt to bridge that gap that felt always doomed to failure. And then in this experience, I think it deepened, that chasm and broadened that distance. So the curiosity here that you're seeing, I think for me, it feels like it's coming from a point that's very far away, trying to almost look through like a paper towel tube at the world. And it feels like we get these very, focused, but almost myopic views of the world around me at the time. And I mean, honestly, it's not that far off from how I experience the world now.
On the daily.
Yeah.
Before I forget, I'm going to interrupt myself just to echo something in the chat. So if you have questions for Daniel, put them in the Q&A now. And this is to the audience, Daniel, not you. and put them in the Q&A now. And in the sort of the last quarter of the reading, we'll get to as many as we can. We get a fair amount of music in this book. Chapter 6, I think it is, opens with almost a full page of song lyrics. So that's the most obvious instance. But of course, your writing itself has so much music, by which I mean, I think, rhythm and attention to the sounds of words, which makes me curious how you attend to sound when you write. Are you someone who reads your work aloud, or do all poets write this musically?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things to say about that. Because the content is so difficult, writing this content was so hard, that one of the ways that I sort of kept doing it, I think, was just by following the sounds of sentences, and just kind of writing, the sound would sort of lead me from sentence to sentence, and in some ways that was kind of like a bit of a shield from the pain. As far as music, it was literally part of the experience that this man, as a method of control and abuse, was using music in the same way that the CIA has been documented using music to torture people, and I think it's an odd question to think about, why music can be so beautiful and so powerful and important to us, and also torture. And I think in this case it reflects the sort of a lot of the experiences about repetition, as is music. Repetition with slight variation, but it's hypnotic and you're lulled in. It's also about the danger of interpretation, right? It's so important that we have the ability to draw multiple meanings out of not just experiences, but out of pieces of art, right? But it also means that if we let someone take a position of authority and tell us what a piece of music means, as happens in the beginning of the book when Larry sits me and Santos down and sort of interprets a song for us and tells us how it means, it has these layers of meaning we can't even see, that type of subjectivity and that kind of release of control over interpretation can be expanded outward from music into anything, into letting someone interpret what your memories mean, what your feelings mean, what your thoughts mean.
I have a follow-up question, but I want to just dwell on something you said, early on you said the listening to the sentence, correct me if I'm misquoting, but listening to the sentences as you wrote them helped you find the next. So almost like you were following a trail of sentences. You wrote one sentence to find the next. Is this what you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, I came from writing poetry. Before I ever wrote this book, I started to suspect that I had sort of lost track of what poetry was, because I was much more interested in sentences, what sentences are as a unit over the line, or, the syllable. And yeah, and that's just, it sort of expanded into prose and into this book. And I just wanted to know if I could write sentences.
So yeah, this is something I'm really curious about, is actually for you as someone who writes both prose and poetry, what is the smallest unit of meaning that you feel like you work with? I write prose. I don't think I can't speak for all prose writers. I don't know how to think smaller than a sentence, but I was interested, not just because of your background, but also there's so much breaking down in this book, breaking down of meaning and breaking down of boundaries. And sometimes it felt that units of meaning were becoming smaller and smaller as this intensely private language developed between you and other cult members. And other times it felt that language itself was meaningless, which will be the subject of like 8 additional questions later. So don't, but yeah, no, I'd love to hear you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think every unit of language, it kind of does its own thing, and there's a whole school of thought around there being like inherent meaning even to the sounds of syllables. Charles Olson talks about this a lot, and the idea that like even like an E sound, has like a feeling to it that's inherent, and I can't get away from that. So I'm thinking about that in the sentences. But I would even go further to say, before I was writing this book, I was all the way on the opposite end and doing a lot with like erasure, and like bringing visual art techniques, I guess, into poetry. Erasure is where you're taking an existing text and then taking things away. And there, the unit of meaning is actually loss, right? It's what's removed. So, in some ways, I felt like what writing a book was for me was like providing an immense amount of context, all these sentences and paragraphs, all to just arrive almost at the negative space. Like, what I'm trying to do is not write a gesture or a look and make it mean something. I'm trying to build all the way to arriving at a moment where it's almost what is not said, but just sort of written around, so that the writer will really feel what it's like to be there, because it's impossible. It's the whole act is impossible to write the actual thing, so you're writing around it.
Writing around it so that so that leads nicely to a question about, I guess, writing trauma, and how you language, that there's so much depiction of just horrific events, horrible things to survive, and yet so much care and artistry, and I would even say control in how it's written. And I wondered about maybe your approach to writing trauma, by which I mean to make it an act of communication with a reader, and also if there were other works that you looked to, for, if not for inspiration, then for like technical assistance. There's a section, I won't read at length, but something, this is on page 83 if anyone's following. So it's inside a sort of like unimaginably horrific moment, but there's a description of the mental processing that's happening. It was too late. It was too strange. While I hadn't been paying attention, some part of me, the main part, had gotten much, much smaller. I was one of the minuscule people posed inside the little digital windows. From deep within one of those boxes, I answered. And I've like returned. Yeah, I've returned to that just because, I gather it's true that anything can be communicated, but sometimes that doesn't feel right. Like there's some things that feels like they should resist language. So how did you take on writing drama?
Yeah, so I think for me, maybe that's where poetry was most useful. The part that you just read, I'm not sure how far away it is from really being a poem, and my whole life, what poetry was for, the poetry I cared about was expressing the inexpressible, right? The thing that there isn't language for, and that creates the necessity for the poem. And that's why poems are so weird, because they're writing about things that feel unrecognizable because we don't have the language for them yet. And so those were the moment that you just read was one of, to me, what felt like very few moments where I let myself step outside of just storytelling, just straight, in the perspective of myself at the time, and try to describe how it felt. And to describe how it felt was impossible, So, I mean, I look to people like, Marie Howe's book, What the Living Do, where she talks about both her brother dying of cancer and the experience of her father abusing her when she was young. These are impossible things to talk about. It's impossible to make someone feel how you felt. Or things like, M. Norbese Philippe, her book Zong, I love, where she's like breaking apart language into its smallest possible units to talk about the horror of both the experience of people who on a slave ship who were murdered, but also the horror now of only having a single legal document with which to sort of piece together that event. Not to say that these are equivalent at all, but in terms of the impossibility of trying to, the problem that you're trying to solve, of like, how do you talk about something that can't be talked about, a story that can't be told. And I also will say the things that I learned from those people and others is that when it comes to the most difficult subjects, the simplest language will do, I tried to not become verbose and attempt to write, just like throw language at it, but to instead let it be as simple as possible and not like florid and not indulgent, and to let the reader feel how gentle I was trying to be with myself in writing it, because I had to sort of protect myself, and by extension, hopefully that meant that I was protecting the reader.
Thank you. And I'll get links to the two books you mentioned, Zong and What the Living Do, and we'll put them in the chat if anyone's interested in those. But if we can, I'd like to stay on the sort of theme of like failures of language. Like what language, I guess, I don't want to say exactly can and can't do, but somehow maybe depicting failures of language or the inevitability of failures of language. There's so much senselessness that this book contends with, and that kind of rises as you become more and more entrenched, I guess, in this cult. And there's also a kind of strange economy of false confessions. I guess this, the idea of confessions and what and the truth and like what and what you confess. So I mean, how do you work with language and show it failing all the time?
Well, I mean, the book in some ways is fundamentally about a failure of language, right? It starts with my dad very early on. There's a moment where we're on the phone and he tells me that it sounds like I'm in a cult, and he's sort of not even saying it very seriously. But the word fails, because the way that we use that word didn't describe what I was experiencing. I was living with my friend's dad in an apartment, and he was putting me and my friends up. It wasn't a religion. No one was going out trying to recruit other members, all these things. It was impossible to recognize myself within that word. So the language failed, and in a lot of ways, the book is about me trying to define what was happening and ultimately to find a place for it within that word. And in some ways, this is like an attempt to redefine that word or a usage of it, which I think is broken. But in all different ways, the book's about language, right? Like at one point they nickname me Daniel, and they're calling me that, and they take the I out of my name. It's like, I'm like misusing French later on in the book, and then miscommunicating, and in the same way that the book is constantly dealing with what's happening internally versus what I'm saying externally. I think that the reader, I hope, feels that failure of language. Like always, we're sort of on the inside, and I at least when I return to this book, I feel it's like I wish that I could have said it, just described what was happening, but it wasn't possible.
Right. And yet, in some ways, there's a the resistance that you eventually form against Larry and the control you're under is a language act.
Mm.
So it's interesting. Language seems to be both is failing and does not save you, and yet does in a way seem to form the exit route.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I would say more so for me, like in the book I talk about sort of after I've physically left, your mind, and this is really common with, all kinds of abusive situations. Like you're still in it, and in some ways I'm still in it today, but language, being able to call it a cult, being able to call it abuse, even years later when the Me Too movement was starting to happen, and being able to not to say that the experience was the same, but to see these people standing up against powerful men and describe the dynamics by which those men had made them feel small or had hurt them. All these things is sort of you get the language and you're able to sort of draw it around what's happened to you, and suddenly you can sort of see the edges of it, and it you just see yourself a little bit more. So in that way, yes, but literally leaving was more like listening to just my body, and just not getting trapped in these sort of rhetorical whirlpools, but instead it's just like, this sucks. I feel bad, and I can finally say I don't care whether or not it's my fault if I feel bad or if I should be doing something better or different to fix it, but I just want to be somewhere else. I want to sleep in my own bed. Yeah.
You mentioned Me Too and the sort of I guess reclaiming the veracity of your own narrative. Did that play in at all to the decision to include photographs? It's an interesting decision, that there's photographs, many of which have a certain abstract quality. They're not figures in them often. Was there something about that, about documentation, that it reminded me a little very early on, you're building a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And this is described in the narrative, and then much later in, and or later, I guess, chronologically, you return and the wall is still there, and it's understood as this sort of undeniable evidence. We were there. Are the photos a little like that wall, or am I missing the point?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, in a way. A lot of the process of writing the book was this strange negotiation between evidence and memory. What does it mean for something to have happened at all? And so much of the experience was someone telling me that just my memory wasn't reliable. So the photos partially I put the photos in because we were reading Sebald for our book club, and I liked how strange these photos felt set against the text.
Daniel and I have a book club.
But yeah, it was a way of saying, yes, this really happened. It was also, by not putting the figures in, it was also kind of a way of saying, like, it doesn't really matter. Like, you should believe me because I'm saying it, that there's value to my account. And I wasn't going to sort of indulge. I felt some pressure to, there was some discussion at one point. I want to be clear, I had a very supportive editor and amazing agent. They were very helpful. But from elsewhere, there was pressure to, maybe we were going to make like a glossy section in the middle, and there was, it would have been great to have more photos that are more sort of showing the inside of the apartment and all these things. And I just didn't want to. I wanted. The book is about how it felt, and so I wanted to put anything in there that made people understand how it felt, but it wasn't about, true crime.
Right. Right. Also, if I reacted physically, it was actually because a fly just flew.
Yes, a bug in your face.
Yeah. I wasn't so taken aback. Yeah, and how you felt, and there you make. I love how I love watching how and when you decide to layer in what I guess I would call a present day insight, in the sense that so often reading this, I'm so inside the experience of becoming more and more under someone's control. And something that initially that would have never, I don't think of myself, probably just because it would be intolerable to think of myself as someone who is vulnerable to that. And yet reading your book, I understood that literally anyone, including me, is vulnerable to that experience. And in part, I think because of how closely you wrote it and how deeply we are inside those moments. And then, but there are times where you sort of pull back, I guess I would say, and speak. I can really hear the writer speaking, the person at the desk looking back. And it's nice. You could teach this book, I'm sure people will. But just in terms of the decisions of when to do that. And there was one, for example, the character Raven, a kind of minor character, a girlfriend.
Yeah,
right?
a human being.
Yeah, sorry. And there's just such a, I don't know, I wanted so badly to understand Raven, to get close to her, and yet it always felt there was something I couldn't push past. Sometimes I could see something like pain in the way she might chew the inside of her cheek, or how the edges of her eyes wrinkled in something of a wince at seemingly random times, which, I don't know, sometimes it like that and periodic other moments sprinkled throughout feel like you, the writer, allowing yourself to step in and provide more insight than you, the, vulnerable teenager, had. So how do you decide how much to do that? What is too much?
Yeah, I mean, the book is nonfiction, and there's like real human beings on the other end, and I was aware of that the whole time. And So there was a limit, I try to remain really squarely inside of my perspective and to make the subjectivity really clear and to leave room for other people's interpretations of events. But I also, in the present day, felt a responsibility to balance that with some kind of explanation or just to protect those people, So I felt compelled to make my limitations clear, and to make it clear that you know, I just didn't want people to fully fall for my version of things, especially when I was so young and just like didn't really know what was going on. And you know, I really wanted people to see how little I was seeing, but you can't just like write about not seeing much. You have to write about it. If that makes sense.
No, yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, well, if I could just say like the care and respect and tenderness for the people you knew then um comes through or came through comes through strongly for me. A quick reminder to all of our participants that you can throw questions in the Q&A. We would get to them in the next probably 10 minutes or so. So now is a good time if you have burning questions for Daniel to throw them in. But I even reading a book in which there is a difficult account being given. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of pleasure in reading it. A lot of there was obviously joy in parts of its making, and one thing that is clear constantly is just like how much you love language, the pleasure and excitement around language. And there's such a charming description early on of you in a English class, and the professor's using words like liminality, and you can almost imagine the words kind of like sparkling to you as a young forgive me but blossoming poet. And I just wondered, like, have you always been in love with words, or did the affair start later?
I think that, I was thinking about this recently. And when I was very young, I found it almost impossible to relate to my family at a certain point. And even to the world around me, to my, growing up in rural New Jersey, and boys were a certain way, and I started to be really aware. I went to all boys camp when I was really young. It just felt like the world made very little sense. And the tool that I'm very grateful that my parents gave me early on, the one thing that they said that they were always, well, the two things they were always willing to spend money on were books, and then if I needed new shoes. But my childhood bedtime story was the Odyssey, and so yeah, words were always my way of making sense of the world, and not just that, but of articulating my own feelings about things to myself as sort of a private space I could go to, where I was understood. And yeah, I mean, it's not by the book. This feels in some ways like a kind of like it's an odyssey. I think of like your new manuscript. This idea. Well, I've been thinking about the Odyssey and in terms of like PTSD because of your writing. But anyway, yeah, words are the only place where I have control, and this was an experience of total loss of control. So the act of writing it is a reclamation. And I think that's why people are often advised to use writing as a tool for recovery from trauma, you know.
Right. Only all our therapeutic writing was this good.
Yeah, well.
But no, the Odyssey, yeah, I think it was in a Jen Percy article on returning combat soldiers, but I hadn't known this before, that in the Odyssey, the siren song is like so intoxicating and appealing, because the sirens are promising those who listen that they'll tell them what happened in the Trojan War. Like it's very related to, you know, an account of what they survived.
Right, and in that sense, it's like it reflects the desire for someone to make things make sense, like to relate your own experience back to you, and to give you a framework, you know, for some relief from just the chaos of existence, and also memory, you know, that someone could just tell you not just what's happening, but what happened, you know, who you are, what has made you who you are, and then how to be. You know, it's I think that we can all relate at least a little bit to the desire to surrender to something like that, to just be told how it is, and then to know, you know. But you know, the reality is that we sort of have to accept that as much as we like desire a leader, you know, someone we can rely on, nobody knows, you know, that in fact the only thing we have is collectivity, you know, and yeah.
Well, we have some questions in the chat, and I'd love to turn to them. Does that sound good?
Yeah, of course. I can't believe we have. I love questions.
All right. Well, Danielle Minert asks.
Hi, Danielle.
What are you working on next? Is there anything you can tell us? They say that, and I agree, we'll all be following your work and supporting you.
That's very nice. I'm trying to accept that what I'm mostly working on is just surviving and recovering from the experience of publishing this book, which I'm, you know, in the midst of. Yeah, and you know, I'm working on other things, but it's hard for me to know whether or not they will be the thing, you know, sort of working on this novel, and I'm not a very industrious writer, so you know, the experience of writing this book, I really relied on the kind of like burst of energy by which I would write a poem, and then just tried to like protract that for 9 months, and I'm not sure if that's really reliable, so I need to just kind of figure out how to work every day, but yeah, we'll see.
I mean, there's like an endless appetite for a little insight into writers' writing lives. And me too. I like inhale Paris Review art of fiction interviews. So the people want to know, do you write longhand? Are you a morning writer, an evening writer? Are you all on the computer? Do you read your work aloud to edit it? Like, give us some details if you don't mind.
Dovetail nicely into Maddie's question there. So the way that I managed to make writing this possible for myself, there was sort of a routine on days that I decided I had to write. I would read first thing in the morning. I'd wake up, you know, have coffee and read, and it had to be a book that made me feel like I want to write. And I think people know that, you know, certain books just you become obsessed with the sound and the sentences and the music, and the, you know, you want to write like that. And I let those books, that writing, kind of carry me like a tidal wave, and then, you know, because otherwise this book is like a cliff that I would have to scale every time to get to the point of even writing. But somehow reading would kind of buoy me up to the top of that cliff, and I could kind of step off of the wave onto the surface and go. So I would literally like be reading a chapter. It was mostly autofiction. Fiction. It was Sheila Heti. I was Michael Chabon, and would try to read a chapter, and then the second that I was finishing the chapter, like have my laptop ready and close the book and go directly into writing with no pause, just because it was the only I needed the momentum. And I would mostly do that in the morning, and then I'd have lunch, and then if I felt capable, I would just repeat the same thing over in the afternoon. And a lot of the times it would just be the morning, and I would sort of walk around Los Angeles in a daze for the rest of the day. But yeah, other books, I guess I kind of answered that question. But yeah, it was mostly it was autofiction. It's like, I hate to say, it was like Ben Lerner and, just like people who wrote fabulous sentences, but also poetry. Anne Carson was like making this possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like Anne Carson made a generation of us possible.
Totally.
But so are you not worried? Do you think about if you read too much of someone, you'll begin to imitate them in your writing, or did that not come up?
Yeah, I was worried about that, and there were things that even after I'd written them, I was like, oh, maybe it kind of sounds like David Foster Wallace. But like, I just had to trust that wasn't really. I'm the reality is I'm not capable of writing as well as those people, or it's just not going to sound like them. So, and I would show it to folks afterwards, and I was told people were like, you don't sound like David Foster Wallace. So I was like, okay, okay. I don't know if that's good or bad, but yeah. Yeah, it's always a concern, but I don't think it's really an actual problem,
Right.
Especially when you've never written prose before. It's like if I'm gonna sound a little bit like Sheila Heti, like I'll take it. That's fine.
That's I have to be careful about reading too much Garth Greenwell, whom
Yeah.
I like revere, but I will I'll start I will start imitating.
Right, but it's like, what's wrong with that?
What's wrong with a little
Yeah.
a cover band?
Right. Right. Should we do this?
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, would you care to answer the one about advice to those writing trauma?
Yeah, we can dispense with kind of the, the like, yeah. So, what advice would I give to others that are trying to write about trauma? Uh, I only wrote this book because I absolutely had to, and I felt like I really held in mind who it was for, and who I was trying to protect in writing it, and it was a moral choice. If there was a version of this where, maybe I could have written it just for myself to make sense of it, and if that had been possible, maybe I would have done that, but it just wasn't the situation I was in. So it depends, like I guess it depends what kind of advice you're looking for. Like, what is the question, to write it more effectively, or to write it more safely for you, or to write it with care for other people, I don't know. I take a lot of breaks, like take so much care of yourself, forgive yourself if you can't do it very much. Yeah, and just try to be honest, to yourself.
Do you have specific tactics when you say being kind to yourself? I think a lot of us find ourselves writing material that has a real emotional toll, and an emotional toll, is a physical toll.
Yeah.
So do you have techniques you use to heal, repair, replenish, keep doing it?
I say that you're allowed to do, like, I had a lot of shame around my coping mechanisms, and I just let those go. And you're like writing the most difficult thing. It's horrible to do. So it's like, if you need to, like, eat an entire box of Oreos? Like, absolutely. And if you need to watch TV all day, fine. Like, it's all those things. It's, my version of self-care is not very glamorous. Like, I tried to take a bath the other day. It was so boring. I just, like, not interested, So I found that I had techniques I developed over years to turn my brain off. And I had started to feel like those were sort of poisonous. And in writing this book, I turned to face the thing, and I was being very present, and I was completely exposed. And I think that we should be allowed to just turn it off, sometimes, and whatever that means for you, and just like forgive yourself. It's like the whole thing. Yeah.
Do you think like inhabiting other characters? Okay, I'm going to expose us both. Daniel and I have a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Daniel is an amazing dungeon master. Do you think that sort of play is somehow, I don't know, has it plays into healing and recovery or getting by?
I mean, yes, but more so in the sense of just like I was so lucky to have friends. I wouldn't have been able to write this book without having like real friends and a real community and a network. I was able to exit. I kept having to dive back in the past, really be inside of it. Like it truly felt like I was superimposing that apartment where all of this happened onto my apartment where I lived, and I was walking around in it, and I was seeing where people were standing and what they were saying. And I needed to be able to leave that and to really feel like I was actually in the world here now, and having people who I love and who care about me and who I can talk to, or play D&D with. That was a real exit strategy, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without that.
Right. And I wonder, thinking about advice, if you have advice, there's so much. What really comes through is you arriving to Sarah Lawrence and like with so much vulnerability, and falling prey to someone like Larry. You have advice, just I don't know, that parents sending their kids to college, like what can make someone less vulnerable?
Yeah, and I'm going to take that opportunity to also answer the question that's from a Sarah Lawrence alum about how I feel about Sarah Lawrence. So, one of my concerns in writing this is that people would. I was trying to respond to what I expected would be like the simplest possible reaction to what had happened, which was, everyone's looking for who to blame so that they can feel like it's tied up with a bow and they can put it away. And it's very easy to blame Sarah Lawrence, or to even blame the idea of college. I've encountered that where people are like, well, this just exemplifies why that's not worth it. And I think that what I was doing at the time and what Sarah Lawrence does well, is create a space where young people are free for the first time to really authentically explore and to individuate and to figure out who they are, who they want to be, and to ask questions and to make mistakes. And so I felt very, very lucky. That's also really hard and really scary. You're kind of at sea. You're 18 and there's just no rules. There's no structure. And so, yes, that makes you vulnerable to someone who might come in and provide structure, stability, answers. So, to speak directly just about Sarah Lawrence, there's like an enormous difference between my experience of the Sarah Lawrence faculty, right? The teachers who I loved and were so important to me, and who frankly were part of why I was able to leave at all, because that was a community that I could exit into. That was a place that had a bed waiting for me eventually. A difference between that and, the administration. And yeah, there are real questions to ask about the responsibilities of an institution like a university as far as keeping tabs on who's on campus, how just, it's just practical questions about security and that kind of thing. But I think there's a way to mitigate the possibility of something like this happening that are frankly not that unrealistic, while also not taking away from the freedom that is an integral part of that time for college students. I honestly, I don't think it's that hard of a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if you, you know, obviously the book is being covered, it's being reviewed, you're being interviewed. So you're sort of entering a larger narrative now.
Mm.
And I wonder if there's sort of narratives about a cult, or I don't know, maybe even like abuse more broadly, that you're trying to sort of resist, narratives you want to like correct or like redirect, or if that's something that you're thinking of now, like sort of now that the book has a life, outside of your computer. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think how to say this? I feel like the word cult has become meaningless to us. It has no practical application. We've walled it off, and it describes an experience that happens to other people far away. It happens that often those people are sort of weirdos or whatever, and it's out in the country, and there's Kool-Aid, or there's robes, or it's in some Nordic country, and they're all blonde for some reason, and so when someone's actually experiencing abuse, they're not in a cult, right? They're in an entirely different situation that's in no way described by that word, and so they have no way of understanding what's happening to them. Yeah, so I mean, I keep trying. I should also say, like, I feel an immense pressure. There's a real desire, especially when the story first came out, to make, people want the most salacious, the simplest version. They want the man who did it to be not a human being, which is a whole separate thing. They want the victims to be kind of weak, scared college students, not their own complicated people having a complicated experience. They want it to be a sex scandal. So I felt like my job in this was to complicate everything, to make people have to confront that this is, it's not unlike a story. It's like a domestic abuse situation, but with more people than a traditional relationship. It's an addiction to a person. It's codependence to the extreme. It's toxic masculinity to the extreme. It's mental illness as a contagion. Yeah. So I just I think all I'm trying to do is make it more complicated for people, which doesn't really sell books, but it's just true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, forgive me, I can be a little sentimental and cheesy, but we're I think we're finishing up now, and just we're in what we call the days of awe, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So I really am in awe of what you've done, and the book you've made, and the experience like you've made comprehensible and to all of us. So thank you for this book, Daniel.
Thanks for saying that. Thank you so much for doing this.
This was so much fun.
Rebecca's book City of a Thousand Gates is really so good. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for joining us and for this finely threaded conversation. I hope everybody has a really good night, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you for hosting us. I hope,
Yeah,
I can't wait to actually visit the bookstore.
I look
Yeah.
forward to many more visits in the future from both of you. Take
I'll be at
care.
that Secret Nunez event. People should go to that. That sounds
Yeah,
great.
she's amazing.
Yeah.
Right.
Great.
Take care and good night.
Good
Thank you.
night. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Bye.